100 years ago, on the 9th of January 1923, Edith Jessie Thompson was hanged in Holloway Prison in North London for the joint enterprise murder of her husband Percy. She had recently turned 29. Her accomplice was her lover, a 20-year-old merchant seaman, Freddy Bywaters, who was hanged at the same hour at Pentonville Prison. This is a story of love and betrayal and of prejudice. It is also the story of a 100-year quest to secure a posthumous pardon for a gross miscarriage of justice, uncorrected to this day. It is also a story that has pertinence to me personally, as you will discover. Edith Thompson was born Edith Jessie Graydon on Christmas Day, 1893, in Dalston, now part of Hackney. She was to be the eldest of 5 children, a sister and 3 brothers. Her parents were William and Ethel Graydon. Her family would move to a new build in a working class part of East London, 231 Shakespeare Crescent, in Manor Park, part of East Ham, in a small terraced house whose garden backed onto a now abandoned railway line from East Ham to Kentish Town. In moving to Shakespeare Crescent, modest homes even at that time, they considered this to be a step up from their former home. This is number 34 Shakespeare Crescent. This is where I grew up from the age of 5 in the coronation summer of 1953, in a neighbourhood still bearing the ravages of the Blitz. It remained my parents' home, they are seen here with my sister, into the second decade of this century. They loved the neighbourhood, and so did I. It is easy to idealise the past, but here was a genuine community, street friend to street and house to house. There were rough diamonds and hard cases, of course there were, but there were strong families, aspirational families. I am sure the Graydon family at 231 was such a family. I grew up with the stories of the infamous crime known then as the Thompson Bywaters murder of the 1920s, and the certain belief among neighbours that Edith's crime was that of adultery, not murder, for which evidence was at best circumstantial and at worst prejudicial. Some had been acquaintances of the Graydon family. Mr. Graydon had lived in the street until shortly before his death in 1941. This is my parents' back garden, then an oasis in a street of now paved-over gardens and granny huts. I include it because at the rear soars the Bastille-like Kensington Junior School, once Kensington Avenue School, so typical of the so-called board schools which dotted the London skyline from the turn of the last century. It was in 1902, in a newly opened school, that Edith Graydon enrolled as an 8-year-old. 8 years behind her was a young Freddy Bywaters, a friend of her brother Bill, who is seated in front of him. This is Freddy Bywaters at the age of 13, the year he left school, and of the school football team. They appear to have won the Shield, but 44 years later, we won the Cup. Freddy lived quite literally on the other side of the railway track, but actually just round the corner from Edith, in Rectory Road. He was a family friend who kicked a football around the streets with Edith's younger brothers. Freddy had left school at the age of 13. He joined a shipping company and eventually the Merchant Navy, having aspired unsuccessfully, because of his age, to join the Arctic convoys in World War I. On the death of his father, ultimately a victim of that war, he became the family breadwinner. He was well-travelled and worldly wise, one consequence of which was that he habitually carried a knife in alien quarters in the likes of Aden and Port Said. And he carried a knife that fateful night of the 3rd to the 4th of October 1922. This is St Barnabas Church in Browning Road, a short walk from both our childhood homes. It also dates to the turn of the 20th century and became almost as central to the community as the school. Believe it or not, I was head chorister there in the late 50s and early 60s. My first choir master was a sixth former at the local East Ham Grammar School, Barry Arscott, who also has an important role in the story about to unfold. And it was here that Edith Graydon married Percy Thompson, a shipping clerk 3 years her elder, on the 15th of January 1916. Hers was in many ways a typical union of the time, her sole courtship as a teenager. Such relationships were routinely expected to result in marriage in a young woman's early 20s. Added to this was the imperative of wartime and the anticipated conscription of Percy, whose papers were in process at that time. The conscription bill became law just 2 weeks after the wedding. And Percy was enrolled in the London Scottish Regiment and was to be packed off to France. But he never arrived there. He received a medical discharge after only a few months of training and sought out the war in civvies. It is possible to anticipate the travails for Edith even from the time of her wedding, from her sister Avis's recollection of the wedding in 1973. I was sitting on the bed with Edie. Dad came to say the car was waiting to take her to the church, and she said, "I can't go through with it. I don't want to go." And my father said, "Oh, you must. Everyone is waiting at the church." She wasn't herself. She was not what you would expect a girl getting married to be. Edith's was a loveless and childless marriage. Percy was a jealous, controlling husband at best, and a drunken, violent one at worst. Edith had left school at 15 to work for a milliner's company in Aldersgate in the city. She was no ordinary, unqualified school leaver. She passed her bookkeeping exams and soon displayed gifts of leadership, rising to a management role as a buyer in a company called Carlton and Pryor. She was also ambitious, upwardly mobile. She had her own office and she had allure, appreciated more by her male peers than her female underlings, who by and large did not take to her. Acknowledged that she kept a part-time lover, a boy, who flitted in and out of her life, meeting semi-clandestinely in cafes near her place of work, did not endear her either. At a time when 9 married women in 10 kept the home, Edith out-earned her husband, £6 a week plus bonuses. She had contributed over half the sum, half of £250, that was needed to purchase a home in Ilford, one of the new suburbs that were growing on the peripheries of London. Their home at 41 Kensington Gardens was designated as a villa. Ilford was vaguely middle class rather than nouveau riche. That home was naturally held in the name of her husband. Though the jazz age and roaring 20s were only just beginning at the time of her death, Edith prefigured it. She danced, she smoked, she took flutters on the horses, she enjoyed theatre, everything from the Palace at East Ham to the Criterion in Piccadilly, where she and Percy spent 3 of their last few hours together. Percy was murdered before reaching home, a home in which Edith was to spend only one more night. On their walk from Ilford Station to their home shortly after midnight on the 4th of October, an agitated Freddy Bywaters lay in wait on the corner of Belgrave Road and Ensley Gardens, 150 metres from their home in Kensington Gardens. He was due to rejoin the P&O ship the Maria and set sail for Australia within 2 days. He had spent part of that evening at the Graydons' house at 231 and at the Avenue public house with Edith's sister Avis. He downed 2 beers, but he may have consumed more later. Alcohol, though, did not figure in the narrative that was to unfold. Freddy had confronted Percy in the summer of 1921, at the start of his relationship with Edith, when he was a paying tenant of theirs. He urged Percy to let Edith go. Percy had responded aggressively on that occasion. There was a violent incident during which Edith was thrown across the room. On the night of October 3rd, 4th, 1922, for reasons not entirely made clear during the trial, Freddy's determination to confront Percy on Edith's condition turned violent. Freddy pulled a knife, slashed Percy before embedding 2 fatal wounds in his neck with a 5-inch double-bladed knife. Within minutes, Percy was dead. Immediately after the attack, an hysterical Edith Thompson ran to her doctor on Belgrave Road, and he attended at the scene. It was assumed that Edith was just a witness to an act of random violence. She was led to her house by bystanders before the police arrived. There were eyewitnesses who gave evidence of a scuffle on Belgrave Road, but because the street was dimly lit, were unable to identify participants. John Webber, who was in his bedroom 50 metres from the crime scene, heard a woman scream, "Oh, don't! Oh, don't!" Webber testified this to the police and in the trial. When Edith left home at 11 o'clock the following morning for questioning at Ilford Police Station, she could not have imagined that she would never return. The police began to question Edith's version of events, where she claimed he had collapsed because of his weak heart. She suffered an agony of confused thoughts, but her instinct was to protect Freddy, and by extension her own reputation and that of her family. She had lied. Initial questioning by police of family and Edith's work colleagues, one of whom had handed the police some letters that Edith kept locked in her desk, threw immediate suspicion on Freddy Bywaters, who was arrested that evening at the Graydon home. He was wearing a blood-stained coat. He was also taken to Ilford Police Station. And as Edith was walked from the matron's room in the police station to the CID room, she saw that Freddy was in custody in the library. It was one of those accidentally on purpose confrontations contrived to persuade the parties to come clean about what had happened the previous night. What followed in the coming days of confinement was a real version of the prisoner's dilemma, where 2 suspects are separated but aware of each other's position in custody. They were not allowed to communicate. Should one betray the other, support the other, deny any involvement, or even knowledge of each other? One thing is clear, is that from the moment Edith espied Freddy under arrest, her equilibrium dissolved. She became an agitated captive. Both subsequently made statements. Freddy's effectively a confession to having caused the wounds that led to Percy's death. In self-defense, he claimed, while denying intent to murder. For Edith, it was a recognition that her young lover had indeed murdered her husband. But as events unfolded, the police initiated the process through which Edith Thompson was transformed from grieving widow to a Jezebel, a depraved temptress who had corrupted a boy. Freddy was only 19 at the start of their affair, and colluded with him in a devilish conspiracy to murder her husband, a Madame Bovary, the Ilford Messalina, for a time among the most famous or infamous women in the country. In this they were aided by the discovery of batches of letters that Freddy had kept at his mother's home in South London and on the Morea. These letters became her death sentence. By extracting the most salacious of the letters, the authorities were about to paint a portrait not only of an adulteress, but of a wicked witch plotting to poison her husband. What did the letters reveal? First and foremost, these are love letters, over 50,000 words written over 14 months, including messages sent to each other when Freddy was on shore leave, right up to the day before the murder. They usually began with the word darlint, darlingest, or darlingest boy. Interpreting the letters was made difficult because of the euphemisms in which they corresponded, and the exact motivation of the two lovers is not always clear. But there was prima facie evidence in those letters that might, in the hands of a skilled prosecutor, be deemed evidence of a wish for Edith Thompson to do away with her husband. Selected sentences or phrases suggested that she wished to be rid of Percy. Several referred to poisons. In his porridge, in his tea. Appeals for Freddy to procure certain chemicals. And reference to ground glass from a light bulb. There were references to a romantic novel, Belladonna by Robert Hitchin, which ends with a woman poisoning her husband. This was referenced by the judge in his summing up, as were various subterfuges to disarm any suspicion Percy might feel about Edith's fidelity. And in a letter of the 20th of September, he has the right by law to all you have a right to by nature and love. Yes, darling, be jealous, so much that you will do something desperate. And most fatally, the final letter of the 2nd of October, the day before the fateful night of 3rd, 4th October. Darling, do something tomorrow night, will you? Don't forget what we talked in the tea room. I'll still risk and try if you will. Try and help. Because they wrote to each other in a private idiom understood only to them, it is difficult to interpret the meaning of these allusions. Were they references to what might be a self-induced abortion? Edith did miscarry in the spring of 1922, or of self-harm, or even of a suicide pact. Were the events she was anticipating in fact plans for elopement? There are clues in other letters of how things may work out for them in a different time, in a different place, maybe Australia. Or was she living out the fantasies of the popular romantic novels of her day? Were her words in fact responses to Freddy's letters, attempts to convince Freddy of her unconditional love? We will never know. and the trial did not conclusively clarify. But for the purposes of constructing a case against Edith as a murderer adulteress, these letters were manna from heaven. Edited highlights were presented to the jury, and they were also placed in the public domain. And the letters were manna for the scurrilous press. The Ilford murders, the Ilford scoundrels were the talk of the country. The case became the cause célèbre of the chattering millions. Many found the idea of hanging a woman repulsive. But interestingly, a mass petition was constructed demanding that Freddy be pardoned. He was a victim of a manipulating older woman. How can you hang Freddy and not hang Edith? Or, if you hang Edith, why hang Freddy? The red tops of the time had a field day. In December 1922, commenting on her trial, the Sunday Express editorialized thus: "It was a case of a mature woman who was weary of her husband and who ached with romantic longing for release from her duty and her obligation. There is no evidence of the restraining influence of religion or honor or morality. They do not come into this wretched story. Where were all the old anchors and moorings in this grimy surge of moral anarchy? It is a glimpse of modern London without a conscience, or an ideal that this is our life and this is how it should be lived." Women had experienced some power in World War I. Those over 30 were awarded the vote in 1919, and with the shortage of young men, they exercised power in the market for spouses. This was the age of the suffragette and the vamp, a challenge to the established and natural order of things. Many viewed female emancipation as a threat to social order, equated it with immorality, and immorality with lawlessness, and all focused through the life and distress of a young woman from East London. Everyone had an opinion, and not only the person on the street. T.S. Eliot, in the year after the publication of The Waste Land, wrote a letter to the Daily Mail on the day before Edith's execution. "On the Ilford murders, your attitude has been in striking contrast with the flaccid sentimentality of other papers I have seen, which have been so impudent as to affirm that they represented the great majority of the English people. Edith's supposedly low-brow intellect, combined with her social climbing and adolescent fantasies, elicited contempt from intellectuals and social betters. And women, too. One of the leading feminists of her age, Rebecca West, described Edith thus: she was, poor child, a shocking little piece of rubbish, and her mental furniture was meagre. I'm not asking for sympathy for Edith Thompson. She is a poor, flimsy, silly, mischievous little thing. She might have implied that this flimsy thing was holding back recognition of women as the equal of men, traitor to her gender. Affairs were for the likes of her, the lover of H.G. Wells for 11 years. The lower orders must content themselves with domestic bliss." Much was made of her childlessness. True women drew fulfillment from motherhood. Hers was a failure to fulfill the role of wife and mother, ordained seemingly by nature. An act of selfishness, more Lady Macbeth than Juliet. Or was she really another Tess d'Urberville, an innocent condemned by the fates to be hanged for the murder of an abusive husband? Interestingly, Thomas Hardy, the author, followed the news on the Ilford murder but remained ambivalent about Edith's fate. He penned these words at the time of her execution. On the portrait of a woman about to be hanged. Comely and capable one of our race, posing there in your gown of grace, plain yet becoming. Could subtlest breast ever have guessed what was behind that innocent face? Drumming, drumming. But had the jury and the public had access to the full corpus of letters between Edith and Freddy, they would have seen something different. Edith was a natural-born writer and lover of books. She had won a writing prize at school and belonged to a reading circle that explored, among other things, the novels of Charles Dickens. She discussed literature in her letters. She discussed theatre. Fantasies about poisoning her husband were peripheral, and seemingly responses to the content of Freddy's letters, which she had destroyed. And there was barely a spelling error or punctuation mark misplaced. This is what her legal counsel, Sir Henry Curtis Bennett, KC, said to the jury in his summing up of the case for the defence. Have you ever read more beautiful language of love? Such things have been very seldom put by pen upon paper. This is the woman you have to deal with, not some ordinary woman. She is one of those striking personalities met from time to time who stand out for some reason or another. In his verdict in dispute, written in 1949, about these events, the journalist Edgar Lustgarten wrote of Edith that she was a woman of quality whose talents were frustrated. She was a remarkable and complex personality, endowed with signal attributes of body and of mind. She had intelligence, vitality, a natural grace and poise, sensitiveness, humour, and illumining all these, that quintessential femininity that fascinates the male. But the man who would determine Edith's fate, Mr. Justice Shearman, thought the letters were full of insensate, silly affection. They were slush. A headline at the time read, "Not innocent, not guilty." Innocence is not the obverse of guilty. Edith Thompson was not innocent according to the moral codes of her time. She had conducted an affair with a minor. She had wished to be free of her husband at a time when divorce was seen as a mark of shame. She had clearly attempted to pervert justice through her lies and obfuscations. And let it not be forgotten that an innocent man was killed. Edith Thompson's path to perdition led from her home in Ilford, through police stations in Ilford and Stratford, to the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, and to the gallows in Holloway Prison. This map traces that path. The first stages took the lovers from an inquest in Ilford Town Hall to a preliminary trial at Stratford Police Court. 2 autopsies were conducted on Percy, the second following an exhumation. They failed to find evidence of poison or of scarring caused by glass, which led a senior police officer to declare that the case against Mrs. Thompson has failed. Edith's spirits lifted. Her family expected her imminent release. But there remained the letters, written months before the murder. They were pored over by the police and the chief magistrate, looking for evidence of intent or incitement to murder. And it was on the basis of the letters that the court ruled that both Freddy and Edith stand trial at the Old Bailey for murder. On hearing this, Freddy remarked, "Why her?" Nothing that Freddy Bywaters said prior or subsequent to this charge against Mrs. Thompson implicated her in the murder, which he insisted was his act and his alone. He did not claim to have been incited or guided by her, and up until his death continued to insist that Edith Thompson was innocent of murder. He did not flinch in this, even though he might conceivably have received clemency if he had. Freddy Bywaters and Edith Thompson were indicted on 2 counts. One for murder and conspiracy to murder Percy Thompson. The second indictment was for attempted murder by poisoning and conspiracy. The latter did not carry the death penalty. The former did. In the event, only the first indictment was tried. The second was never tried, and it was ruled that the defendants would stand trial together at the Old Bailey. The trial became one of the most famous or infamous in the history of the Central Criminal Court. It gripped the nation. It was the front page story. Edith and Freddy became waxwork figures in Madame Tussauds' House of Horrors. People queued up all night to secure seats in court or sell their access to others. Given this febrile atmosphere, a fair trial would require judging of the highest integrity. The trial became an arena for some of the most distinguished and powerful figures of the judiciary. Edith Thompson's appointed attorney was Sir Henry Curtis Bennett, KC. Freddy's was Cecil Whiteley, KC. Leading the prosecution was none other than Thomas Inskip, the Solicitor General in the newly formed government of Andrew Bonar Law. Assisting him was Mr. Travers Humphreys, described as the sharpest legal mind in Britain. And presiding was Mr. Justice Shearman, a man of rectitude, who had resisted the introduction of women jurors. There was one woman on the jury for this trial, but he referred to them all as gentlemen. And he constantly referred to the co-defendants as the adulterers. Despite Sir Henry's application for Edith Thompson to be tried separately, the 2 defendants stood trial together, reinforcing the idea that the murder was a joint enterprise. Freddy's only hope was that he could prove self-defense and that this was not an act of premeditation. And this would probably not suffice. There was little prospect he would escape the noose unless he incriminated Edith. For Edith, conviction required not only that there was proof of premeditation on Freddy's part, but that she was a party to that premeditation, that she had lured Percy to a pre-arranged assassination, requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt. Because the forensic report on Percy Thompson had already failed to show evidence of poisoning, Edith's counsel tried to remove Edith's letters from the trial. There was no unbroken chain between letters written in the spring of 1922 referencing poisoning and a killing by knife on the streets of Ilford many months subsequent. Justice Shearman overruled this and declared the letters to be germane to the case if they revealed intent to murder. Edith did not aid her case by insisting that she testify in court. This was against the advice of her counsel, who insisted that she had nothing to answer for. The burden of proof was upon the prosecution. To enter the witness box, she was to open herself to endless questions about the letters. And the country's leading prosecutor obliged and challenged her mercilessly on the meanings of her letters, parts of which she could not or would not explain to the satisfaction of the jury. But there are two aspects of the trial that best explain the outrage felt 1 century later. The first was the reading aloud over 2 sessions of the trial of the selected parts of Edith's letters to Freddy, already available in print form for the jury. Letters of the most personal meanings to the 2 defendants and obscure to the rest of us. The letters were read by Travis Humphreys. Edith sat sobbing throughout the readings with her head in her hands, trying desperately to avoid eye contact with her mother, out of the shame these revelations might bring to her family. In a sense, Edith suffered a double killing, one on the gallows and the other a character assassination, designed not only to lead the jury, but also with an eye to the public, whose morbid fascination proved an important backdrop to the trial. Finally, we should examine the judge's summing up and guidance to the jury. At the outset, Mr. Justice Shearman's words offered hope for Edith. He instructed the jury to find Edith Thompson guilty only if they were convinced that she had lured her husband to the place where he was murdered. Now, I am going to ask you to consider only one question in your deliberations, and that is, was it an arranged thing between the man and the woman? Had Mr. Justice Shearman placed his full stop here, then Edith, but not Freddy, would probably have walked free that afternoon. There was no evidence that Edith Thompson had lured her husband to that place at that time with the intention to murder. None had been presented. Only vague intimations about clandestine meetings and obscure letters passed between them. But it was through these vague intimations and obscure letters that Mr. Justice Shearman chose to lead the jury to a verdict of murder. He doubled down on the evidence of the letters. His was effectively a second prosecutor's summing up, but even more vehement and scornful, an exercise in petitio principii, of assuming what it seeks to prove, that the letters had formed part of an unbroken chain of conspiracy that led directly from letters to the knife. There were the usual references: the poisons, the novel belladonna, the clandestine meetings, the various subterfuges. But there had been no evidence produced in the trial that might explain how all this translated to a knife attack some months later. This he failed to acknowledge. He emphasized Edith's attempts to conceal the truth in her initial statements to the police. Lying had become synonymous with murder. And he asserted that Edith had feigned her distress at the murder of her husband. And he told the jury to discount as unreliable the evidence of Mr. Webber, who heard a woman scream, "Oh, don't, because it was some distance from the scene, 50 meters. But the passage that is usually regarded as most condemning Edith was not one of law and justice. You are told that this is a case of great love. Take one of the letters as a test. He has the right by law to all that you have by nature and love. Gentlemen, if that nonsense means anything, it means that the love of a husband for his wife is something improper because marriage is acknowledged by law, and that the love of a woman for her lover, illicit and clandestine, is something great and noble. I am certain that you, like any other right-minded persons, will be filled with disgust at such a notion. He was judge, but he had become a surrogate prosecutor, a moral arbiter, and through omission and misdirection, by petitio participi, a usurper of the powers of the jury, who were effectively invited to pass a verdict of guilty on Freddy Bywaters and Edith Thompson. In less than 2 hours, they returned with the required verdict. The verdict was unanimous, and Mr. Justice Shearman sentenced both to death by hanging, to be on January the 3rd, 1923, but delayed a few days for an appeal. The appeals were presented on December the 21st. The Court of Appeal consisted of the Lord Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Darling, and Mr. Justice Salter. Their appeals were held separately, Freddy's first. The counsels for the defence made a case that in summary asserted that the judge had misdirected the jury through his omission of key evidence, including of the autopsies, through presupposition, and a failure to establish an unbroken link between letters and the murder. While the Court of Appeal conceded that there was a lack of direct evidence of firm collusion in the final act, they held that earlier prolonged incitement to murder revealed in her letters, combined with her lies about what happened on the night of the murder, her meetings with Bywaters on the day of the murder, and the content of her last letter were sufficient to convict her of arranging the murder. The sentence of death was upheld. It would be carried out on the 9th of January 1923. All that remained was a flurry of appeals for clemency, letters written by the families to the King, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and one 11th-hour car ride across the country. And then, 2 days before the executions, came this appeal by Freddy Bywaters, made to the Home Secretary. Not for him, but for Edith. She is not only unjustly condemned, but it is wicked and vile to suggest that she incited me to murder. There was no plan or agreement between Mrs. Thompson and I to murder her husband. I can do no more, sir, than ask you to believe me, and then it is for you to proclaim to the whole world that Edith Thompson is not guilty, and so to remove the stain that is upon her name. But to no avail. On the morning of the 9th of January 1923, Edith Thompson was sent into oblivion, hanged for adultery. The response to her death was felt immediately, not least among the 4,000 who thronged the streets outside the prison. Rumours abounded of the torments that Edith had endured in her final minutes. It was speculated that she was pregnant, and that as she fell, her innards fell out. The presiding medic swore that he would never again witness the hanging of a woman. The hangman, John Ellis, recounts her total emotional collapse, her legs pinioned and her arms tied behind her back. And though it was a requirement of law that prisoners be conscious at the time of death, such was the state of her anguish that she was injected with a sedative to keep her calm. She moaned like an animal writhing in an abattoir as she was carried the 7 meters from condemned cell E to the trap door and the final act. No friends or family present, just a bunch of mostly male observers. It is thought that the effects on the hangman, John Ellis, contributed to his suicide a few years later. Edith was not the last hanging of a woman. Another victim fell in Scotland in October of the same year, but none have created the outrage that followed the death of Edith. Among those who reported on Edith's death was the best-selling author and journalist Edgar Wallace. He was invited to cover the trial in December 1922. He refused. "I refuse the commission. I will not see this woman sentenced to death. She is tried and condemned, and there is no hope for her." After the execution, Wallace wrote, "Never in our history has there been so terrible a miscarriage of justice, or a verdict based so little upon evidence and so much upon prejudice, as that which sent Edith Thompson to that filthy scene in Holloway Jail. I can tell you this, that if the true story of Edith Thompson's execution were ever published, half the people who read it would be physically sick. And the horror is intensified by the sure knowledge that she died innocent of the crime of murder. There were 2 murders committed in the Thompson case. The first was the killing of Percy Thompson. The second of the murders was committed at Holloway Jail on January 9th. If ever in the history of this country a woman was hanged by the sheer prejudice of an uninformed public, and without the slightest modicum of evidence to justify the hanging, that woman was Edith Thompson." The story never went away. Edith really did become the Tess d'Urberville of her time. In 1934, F. Tennyson Jessie, who wrote widely on the crime and punishment of women, penned a novel, A Pin to See the Peep Show, a fictional account based on the Thompson Bywaters murder. By all accounts, it is a powerful, compelling novel. A staged version in 1951 failed to pass the censor, but the story was serialized for television in the 1970s, with Francesca Annis playing the Edith character. In 1947, Alfred Hitchcock, who by strange coincidence had been taught how to dance by Edith's father, and who knew Edith as a child, directed The Paradigm Case, again a story of an unhappy woman accused of poisoning her husband. And her story recurred through the years. Several novels were based on the tragedy of Edith Thompson, including 2 by Agatha Christie. James Joyce used the trial transcripts as background in Finnegan's Wake, and P.D. James, who had lived in Ilford, wrote The Murder Room in 2004, also based on this case. There was a radio drama here, a documentary there, and another movie, Another Life, in 2001. In 2018 came the publication of Rex versus Edith Thompson, A Tale of Two Murders, by Laura Thompson, no relative, a feminist critique of the case against Edith Thompson, a victim of a highly prejudiced and gendered trial and appeals process. It's a terrific read. Edith's journey, though, had not ended. In 1971, as Holloway Prison prepared for a makeover, the graves of those women executed in the prison were removed. According to the ruling, families of the deceased were entitled to reclaim the body of their loved one and rebury her at a place of their choosing. The family of Ruth Ellis, the last woman in the UK to be hanged, availed themselves of this concession. The other four families seemingly did not. Their bodies would be reburied in Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. Edith's sister Avis only became aware that Edith had been removed to another place 2 years after it had happened. Edith's resting place was now a mass grave of 4 hanged women in separate coffins, piled one on top of the other and buried deep in the earth. And then, in 1993, as a result of the work of some remarkable men, the Ministry of Justice permitted a headstone to be laid atop that mass grave. It was dedicated on a rainy Saturday in November 1993, and the headstone said simply, "Sleep on, beloved. Her death was a legal formality." This is a picture from the dedication service. In the centre of this picture is John Clark, the historian of the Brookwood Cemetery, who had assisted in making this event possible. The other 3 men are all known to me, but through different strands of my life. To the left, with the earphones, is the late Paul Gillingham. Paul was a former colleague of mine in Hong Kong. In 1993, he was recording the service for a radio documentary on the Thompson Bywaters murder. He excitedly got in touch with me. "I am making a radio program about the street where you grew up, Shakespeare Crescent. I've just walked past your parents' home, and I interviewed a man who said he was your choir master when you were a small boy." This was the late Barry Ascot, then vicar of St Barnabas Church. He led the service of remembrance that day. Barry had made it one of his life's missions to never abandon Edith Thompson, to work towards an official pardon for a miscarriage of justice. He held a memorial service every January on the date of her execution. Paul also insisted I read this book, Criminal Justice, The True Story of Edith Thompson, published in 1988 and written by Renee Weiss, who is wearing the raincoat in this picture. Renee is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at University College London, one of the country's foremost authorities on Shakespeare, and for many years the trustee of the Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, now my hometown. I got in touch with him after reading the book to point out aspects of the borough that he had not realised when he wrote the book. We have communicated ever since. Here he is in my garden on one of his frequent trips to the home of the bard. For over 3 decades, Renee has worked to reverse the verdict against Edith Thompson. He is now recognised as Edith's heir and executor and owner of her grave and the grave of her parents, the last of the Graydon children having died in 1978. He has also analysed the corpus of letters that Edith sent to Freddy during their 16-month affair. This was no flimsy little creature. This was a mature woman, rich in imagination, a natural-born writer who, had she lived in different times, might have gone on to study literature at university and become a writer of substance herself. Renee has worked ceaselessly and continues to work for official acknowledgement of the wrong inflicted on Edith Thompson 100 years ago, including this letter sent to the then Home Secretary Douglas Hurd in 1988 after the publication of his book. His most immediate project was to meet the Graydon's family wish that Edith be buried with her parents in the City of London cemetery in Manor Park. This required endless petitioning of the Ministry of Justice and of other bodies, but he persisted. And in the early autumn of 2018, I was told that permission had been granted, all subject to the coffin in that mass grave being distinguishable as Edith's. On the 20th of November, Edith's coffin was identified by a small plaque on a coffin, and her body was exhumed and laid to rest for 2 nights in a funeral home in Kingston-on-Thames. On the morning of the 22nd of November, Edith was driven across London and slowly past her school to her childhood home at 231 Shakespeare Crescent, where the cortege stopped before halting again outside St Barnabas Church, and then on to the City of London Cemetery, where I awaited the arrival of the cortege with about 40 people, some of whom had travelled from as far as Sydney, New South Wales, and a bevy of BBC cameramen and reporters who filmed the proceedings. The funeral was intensely moving and included a recording of Edith's sister, Avis, giving a radio interview many years later, a eulogy from Renee, and an order of service that included a letter written to a friend on Boxing Day. I will give you a minute to read it. This was Edith Thompson. And as we progressed to the burial plot, a literary allusion came to my mind. Not of Madame Bovary or Tess, but Dido, Queen of Carthage, her lament from Henry Purcell's Dido and Aeneas. A few words that I'm sure she would have liked to have said to her parents at the denouement. Edith understood the shame she had brought upon her family. Every visitor in those days was met with, "How is mother holding up? When I am laid to earth, may my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast. Remember me, but forget my fate